So I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Yeah, we only have room till 2 minutes. Those of you who are like sitting behind the column, you might regret that later. So consider some of the other seating options available. So, I mean, welcome everybody to this first episode in a series of events that we're going to be doing here really across the next year around the idea of publicatory practices in architecture here at GSAPP. I'm James Graham, I'm the Director of Publications, and the Publications Office, I think, is completely involved in sort of both sides of this question of publicatory practice, both thinking and critiquing from a kind of academic remove the sort of various mechanisms of architectural thought that publications are involved in on one hand, and then on the other, being actively engaged in the sort of prodigious deluge of media that comes out of institutions like this one. So I'm super excited to have Luke, Jeanette, and Georgine here today to help us think through some of the questions that are animating our ongoing work on both sides of the sort of academia and practice spectrum. So about a week ago, to kick off our sort of Friday lunch series, we had a really wonderful talk from Tom Weaver, my counterpoint at the Architectural Association in London, on the topic of his editorial practice. And he began with Victor Hugo's famous proclamation, "Ceci fera cela," this will kill that, which in its original context meant, as you know, that the printing press would sort of kill off the building as the kind of site of human meaning. And Tom noted that it's become a bit of a cliche to start talks about books and buildings with this passage, but then he went on to sort of offer a brilliant critique of the kind of unchecked proliferation of architectural print media that we've seen in the past years, let alone in digital media. And he used it to sort of offer a kind of editorial repentance for his own complicity in the sort of rise of media over building as building. But so at the same time, I think I would argue that maybe if print media did in fact kill the building in some form, in doing so it might have also birthed that thing we call architecture. And on the surface, I mean this in the kind of fairly familiar sense that architecture isn't so much the kind of grouping of the most worthy physical built artifacts, but architecture is a discourse shaped by the arguments that we have about architecture as much as buildings themselves. And so the history of architecture in this sense could be seen as a history of essays, treatises, guidebooks, surveys, standards manuals, polemics, all the other kind of media that we put to use in the making of discourse. But I think there's another level here, which is that print media recently has become itself another site of architectural production, not just the discourse, but a form of kind of activating and positing new sorts of architectural ideas. In this kind of publicatory practice, it's a bit separate from the promotional function of publications, monographs, trade journals, etc. And it also stands a bit apart from the apparatuses of discourse like journals and historical and theoretical texts. So more and more architectures, thinkers, and designers are looking to publications not as a way only of disseminating their work, but of producing that work, constructing different kinds of knowledge, experimenting in new architectural media, and articulating a kind of spatial politics by expanding the audience of architectural thought. And these sorts of publicatory practices can be seen as an attempt at bringing a new kind of attentiveness, I think, to the stuff of architecture and urbanism, whether material, discursive, or political, and by heightening that attentiveness, potentially transforming something. So I'd say who better to have these conversations with than this brilliant group of sort of hybrid thinkers, practitioners that we have here today. We're going to start with Luke Bowman, who is a graphic designer and founder of Thumb Design, and somebody that we consider a real friend and ally of the school. He's done a lot of great work for our own GSAPP Books imprint. He's worked with the Buell Center recently on their Modern Architecture Symposium book. And he's also actually worked with Georgine, sort of fortuitous, and I hadn't totally thought about that when we were getting invited, but I think it's a really fortunate connection. And he also teaches on architecture and books at the Yale School of Architecture. Then we'll hear from Jeanette Kim, who you all know as a faculty member here, director of the ARPA program, and founder and editor of ARPA Journal, which has provided a really needed space for thinking about the sort of modes and results of architectural research in our field. She's got an active design and research office, all of the above, and her own work on ecologies and public space has led her into collaborations with a pretty incredible array of public institutions, which I think is really interesting. And then we'll hear from Georgine Theodore, one of the principals of Interborough, which has accomplished this sort of trifecta of winning the PS1 Young Architects competition, the Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award, and the AI in New York's New Practices Award. And a lot of their work has played really actively with different sort of tropes, genres, and formats of publication. And I would say that few offices are as publicly engaged as Interborough is. And she also teaches at NJIT, where she directs the infrastructure planning program. And then after that, we're going to retire to the drawing room. And Amal will offer a response. And Amal's here not only as our dean, but as obviously a practitioner who's done a number of experiments of her own in the realm of publication. So with that, join me in welcoming Luke Bowman.
Right. So, this is 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Yeah. Okay, so my name is Luke Bowman. I was trained as an architect, but I practice as a graphic designer. And in addition to my practice called Thumb, I also teach with one foot in graphic design and 1 foot in architecture. My foot in graphic design is at Parsons, and I teach thesis. That's a one-year course. With the same group of people for a whole year, which is really fun. And then my architecture foot is at Yale, and I've taught a class seminar since 2008 or 2007, I can't quite remember, called Books in Architecture. And these are a couple of the kind of like bait posters that I put up in the last couple of years, which are to invite people to come to the first class to kind of see what's going on with that seminar. The seminar basically kind of actually started with this idea about trying to think about what is the alternative to the portfolio class, what we were just talking about. And my argument is that instead of like making a beauty pageant class, which would basically refine portfolios to the point where they have the most sheen and gloss, I actually thought that what we should do is try to design a class where we would integrate the idea of producing books with the idea of producing architecture. So the idea of the book as another means of producing the architectural project was right at the forefront of the thing. So from the get-go, the idea is to produce, I think we do like 4 or 5 distinct book projects in the course of the seminar. And it starts with the project that's called 256, which I'll talk about at the very end. But the second kind of phase of the project is to look at precedents and basically perform a sort of an anatomy lesson on a series of books, just a handful of them that we've done over the years, in order to kind of understand the combination of their content and their organization, their form, their distribution, who their neighbors are, what their influence was, and so on. So this gang of books, so I usually have 12 people in the class, and usually 2 of them pair up, so we do analysis of 6 projects, 6 book projects per year. And generally, the result of which is largely forensic in nature. This, for example, is a study that showed the image distribution as it's distinct from the first edition of Learning from Las Vegas, designed by Muriel Cooper, versus the second edition, which was essentially anonymous but assumed to be some kind of Venturi Scott Brown type of design action, very anonymous and appropriately so. So you can kind of see like the idea about, okay, the distribution is much more even in the Muriel Cooper versus a much more dialectic thing that's happening in the second edition. There's a whole history of that thing. We love it, and we're not going to talk about it. So the thing that I really felt like was a criticism that kind of arose out of that precedent study was twofold. One was that the analyses tended to be more about the formal aspects of the book, like you were just looking at, which is fine and I believe completely necessary, but I also wondered if we might be able to develop a more engaged relationship with the content of the books. In other words, if we could find a way to operate on a set of ideas through form, we might be able to arrive at a more plastic relationship with the idea of what the book is relative to architecture and architecture's practice. The second thing that I was most curious about was most of the time a book is proposed as a single person's endeavor. Many of the projects are just individually initiated and presented. What I wondered is if we could, as a group, out of 12 people, 13 if I include myself, could we make a book collectively? And if we could do that, how would the labor be divided, which is a necessity, but also remain related? And so there are issues of how can we actually collaborate, which is a hallmark issue of architectural practice, using the grounds of the book, right? So it kind of moves the book away from being about a monographic expression and moves it towards a more collective expression. So so that's the kind of precept of the thing. And then the second part of this is an interest in a certain type of book that I have, which I just call the dry book. And this, for me, is epitomized in this actually rather mundane book by Werner Blasser on Mies van der Rohe. It's 1970, I believe 1974, sorry. The original edition, this is a paperback edition of it in the trade paperback size, basically 6x9. And let me just run this again so I can speak to it. This book, when you look through it, as you just did, you can see is incredibly straightforward. It is a straight-up presentation of the documentation of Miesian projects. There's a little bit of text at the beginning, but it basically unfolds as this kind of chronological history of the projects, going from the competitions through the early small house projects, all the way up to the very largest projects that we know. So essentially it follows this kind of very regularized art historical kind of model of how to organize a body of work. I love this book because it is so dull. No people. This like crossovers of the actual dissection or the plan right opposite of how the curtain wall works. So it's very orthographic. It's very dry, and it has a Miesian sort of white space kind of combination to it. So I think that while at the same time I love that book, I also find fault in it, in that it doesn't really follow this idea that our friend Mies presented at the inaugural of his assuming the deanship at what would then become IFT. And the statement, which I think we're all familiar with in some way, which basically is the assertion that architecture is part of its time, and that how it's embedded in its time is a way that we can measure its efficacy. And it's quite eloquent. As I understand it, also Mies's English was not very good at this point. So it's a very short, this is actually a portion of the statement. The statement was very short, but it was really super clear. And so the idea that we had was to maybe test that book, that dry book by Werner Blasser, and attempt to basically expand that thing or test it against its zeitgeist. So the way that we thought to do that would be to basically, this is the brief for the project, would be basically to unpack that history, and then each person would be responsible for developing this sort of parallel history that goes along with each era of Mises' career. So what you would get is you would get a section in the 20s, a section in the 30s, all the way up until the 60s. There are 12 people in the class, so we had a preamble section, and then we also had a postscript. So the preamble basically was the history of the universe prior to 1886, which was the date of birth for Mies van der Rohe. And then we followed after 69 to kind of just see how that sort of played out. But basically, what we're trying to do is compare cultural, historical, material, in moments of technology, invention, communication against this body of work just to see what would happen, right? So the book looks something like this. It's quite a small book. What we do is we actually reproduce the original book on gray paper, and then all of the new material that is injected into the book is printed on yellow paper. So at any moment within the book, you know exactly what the authorship or the era of the authorship is belonging to, right? So it's very clearly kind of diagrammatic of that process. So here at the beginning of the book, you're looking at the prehistory. And then as we kind of move, as we move slowly into, this goes for about 3 minutes. As we move slowly into the era of the 19th and 20th centuries, then we start to see these kind of juxtapositions. Along the way, also kind of seeing a few things that we might be able to recognize as being precedents or neighbors to Miesian projects. So he had a number of really lovely portraits, didn't he? He was quite photogenic for being a squat fellow. So I'm going to just not speak for a moment, let this kind of play for just a moment, and then I'll take up after that. I think the flipping begins at any moment, yes. So this very clear kind of separation of these different kind of authorships. The other thing that you'll kind of see occasionally is there's a sheet of basically what's cardstock in order to produce different sections, larger sections of the book. The book expands by, goes from being 248 to being just short of 500 pages. So it's really expanding quite a bit. And in the process, you kind of begin to get these juxtapositions so you can see what exactly is happening within broader culture relative to the architectural production of the office. So there become these sorts of moments where you can get a sensibility, there is a sensibility about space that you could say is consonant between popular culture and, I believe this, if I'm not mistaken, is Toronto Union. And there is these moments of consonance, but there's also, I think, some pretty amazing moments of contradiction as well. So on the left, there's a lunch counter sit-in, approximately 1960, 62, and then as I understand, I believe that's the Seagram, one of the board meeting rooms. So you can kind of see the different roles that are being undertaken by space and accommodation that contrast to each other, and we find that to be really very super interesting. The idea of producing these books, is not to create something that is whole and then completed in itself and then can be published in some way. The idea is to produce these like engines for thinking about the relationship between a practice and its moment. Consequently, they're very loose. They're suggestive. They sometimes completely fail to have any energy in a particular spread or section, but that's okay because it's really about this collision, this kind of accident. Everybody, so in the process of doing this is a 1-week project. Everybody goes away, collects their material, and then we bring it all together in one 3-hour session. So it's like you have a book that grows by twice, basically in the course of a week. And then I'll talk about what the outcome of that is shortly. So the second, sorry, let me go back to this, or back to that. The second book, so that was 2013, and then 2014 last year. I wanted to try that again, but I wanted to try it on something else. Something a little bit, let's say, less perceived as being monolithic or one of the great archetypes. And so I always really loved this book by Friotto, actually by Conrad Roland, about Friotto's practice. But it was a particular book that kind of took this kind of scientific method that Friotto had kind of developed with the tension structures and using these kinds of natural systems as a way of kind of developing architectural form. And we decided to kind of basically run the same operation on it. That book is a landscape format, so it has a different kind of affect to it. And it basically conforms to the same orientation of the previous book. The yellow pages are the injected material, and then the gray pages are the existing material. Once again, this book was organized chronologically, so the overlay, the historical overlay that we produced is also organized chronologically. So you have the prehistory. It turned out that Friotto's job, before he was an architect, he designed aircraft for the Luftwaffe. So he had this intense engineering background. And so that becomes a big part of like trying to look at the idea about what is technology transfer, how does that actually operate relative to an architectural practice. And so along the way there are certain other practitioners, mainly Bucky Fuller shows up quite a lot in this book, not right here exactly. So that we can kind of see exactly what is going on with that practice relative to technological development, the popularization of the use of metal and fabrics in architecture, developing really from that post-war era all the way up until this book actually stopped short of the Munich Olympics in '72. So our postscript in this book was to actually fold in the amazing tensile structures that are so beautifully shown in the 1972's Stadia, which is still standing. So I'll just let this go for just a minute, and then I'll talk about phase 3. Since it works so fast, there's no captioning for anything. It's really the methodology is entirely visual, and that's one of the things that allows us to act really quickly. So it's really about just trying to produce these juxtapositions in order to try to just unfold, or I don't like that term, but unfold like this idea about what the practice is relative to its time. So, what we're going to do this year is we're going to do it Gangbusters. We're going to do 6 books this time, and so there'll be a total of 8 books that have been expanded at the end of this session, at the end of this year. And the way that's going to work is going to be slightly different. The experiment is that we're going to develop the historical pool is going to be developed all together, and we'll make 6 copies of that pool of historical material, and then groups of 2 people will integrate that same historical material into each one of these books. So I would be very grateful for you to offer other books that you think, if you think I'm missing something, I know I am. But I would love to hear what these are. These aren't set, so these are just the ones that I'm thinking about right now. There's this beautiful book on Robert Maillard, on the bridges of Robert Maillard, designed and edited by Max Bill, which I think is an interesting thing. These are all dry books in my estimation. There's the Corbusier Ode Complète, which would be daunting to do. Maybe only maybe one volume of that. There is a volume of that was done by Max Bill also, which is interesting. This one is de rigueur. We must do this only just to bug Bob Stern, the dean, because I think he would be amused. This one I'm really very excited to do because it's not a dry book in the kind of that Misesian sense, but it is completely hermeticized in many ways. So I would really like to see how do the 60s and 80s stack up against this stuff. This one, if anybody has a copy of this, I would so thoroughly appreciate you loaning it to me. I'll try not to break it. This is like the progenitor. If you've ever seen this book, it's the progenitor to SMLXL. It's basically a history of the fax as it affected the OMA office in the 80s. It's a really, it's an incredible book. It's a mythical book to me. So you can see I'm moving through the decades, right? Yes, of course, Made in Tokyo, which we've actually done precedent analysis of this book 3 times. I think it's time to operate on it and see what happens when you actually, where is Godzilla? I think it's the question that we really want to ask. And then this one, which is pretty fresh, is last year, the David Chipperfield monograph, which is incredibly beautiful and subtle in so many ways, but also remains a very hermetic project. Okay. So where does that go? In addition to it being produced within the seminar, and then at the end of the year, there's an exhibition for that material at the school. In 2013, we had a project room at the New York Art Book Fair, and this was at MoMA PS1. And basically, we laid out this project, this single project, the 256 images that matter to architecture, 47 different versions of that. So each one of these books is what somebody believes is the thing that matters most to architecture. And then as a composite, it's an interesting portrait of what might be understood as kind of like a psychogram, let's say, a visual psychogram of what contemporary students, I think, are thinking about as the definition of architecture, at least at Yale. On the monitor up there, I was actually doing a preview of the Mies book. So the Mies book didn't actually appear there. And so what's going to happen is in 2015, this year, we'll be doing another project room with the Art Book Fair at MoMA PS1. And the idea with that will be to present the 8 books, the 8 expand books. The part of the class which is going to be important is to start thinking about the kind of spatial implications of readership within a room, and the idea of like a public reading, because I think that that's also like something that we kind of have a responsibility for, and just thinking about everything from flow to duration to seating position, relationship of book to the individual, all of that will become part of the product. That's what I have to say. I'm willing to assume that
Great, thanks. Today I want to talk about guidebooks, and I thought they would be a kind of useful reference point for today precisely because they position themselves between publication and practice, or they themselves kind of engage in a form of practice. They, for example, lead readers into corners of the city, or they put ideas into practice. They are a vehicle for influence and a call to action. They're also everywhere, from the Harvard Design School Guide to Shopping to Made in Tokyo. Guidebooks are multiplying so quickly that they seem to have overshadowed the Manifesto as a site for architectural discourse. I'll confess I'm complicit with its proliferation. Guidebooks have played a big role in my design practice and my research lab alike. So today I thought I'd examine my own kind of dual love and skepticism for this genre and test how we might pull back from the precipice of its extreme overuse. So what do guidebooks do? Some take us on a tour. The WPA-sponsored American Guide series, for example, captured the spirit of American life for the uninitiated, either on the road or in the armchair. Murray Travel Guides, a kind of precursor to the Guidebooks volumes, prided themselves on matter-of-fact clarity and accuracy. To avoid bewildering the reader, these books suppressed room for interpretation of tourist sites and were thus subject to criticism that they would promote passive, superficial, and mindless consumerism. But guidebooks also open inaccessible sites and experiences beyond the grind of everyday life. 18th century English country estates permitted entry to those who would only be spectators through the aid of small, portable, relatively inexpensive publications. Or more recently, the LA Urban Rangers encouraged their readers to ignore no trespassing signs installed in Malibu beaches by teaching them the intricacies of dry sand easement law. So this guide teaches you how to just barely stay within the limits of the law. Guidebooks convince and command. They encourage us to act, and they train us to get it right. As with the tour, these actions both conscript and empower. So books on sustainability, for example, suggest best practices with a can-do spirit. Graphic standards, reference manuals enforce building code standards and offer instructions for replicable sequences, such as details for production. As a site for research, the guidebook is less a site in which knowledge is verified and more a site in which ideas are put into practice. So I'd like to take a closer look at this guidebook, which comes not from architecture, but from workplace management. It's an employee's manual created in 2012 by Valve, a software company in Bellevue, Washington, which is most famous for creating the first-person shooter video game, HalfLife. The manual declares, you decide what to work on. Each employee is encouraged to choose his or her team organically and decide for themselves which product to support and which experiments to run. As the guidebook says, employees vote on projects with their feet or with their desk wheels, as illustrated in this little diagram. Like many workplaces in today's creative economy, the premise here is that workers are the company's most valuable capital, and the best system for an enlightened workforce is self-organization. So the manual writes, when you're an entertainment company that spent the last decade going out of its way to recruit the most intelligent, innovative, talented people on earth, telling them to sit at a desk and do what they're told obliterates 90% of their value. We do have a founder or a president, but even he isn't your manager. You have the power to greenlight projects. You have the power to ship products. So this book tells us, this book exists not to tell us what to do exactly, but to help us understand the lack of structure and a culture of permissiveness. The book is very aware of the fact that it's just making everything up. It reminds you that you're on your own and admits that, for example, Valve is not good at helping new people find their way, at mentoring people, and can even tend to exclude people in completely new disciplines. But this book also exists to reassure you that this is okay. And for this reason, I think this book is very much a guidebook of our time. In this passage, for example, it says, if you find yourself walking down the hall one morning with a bowl of fresh fruit and Stumptown roasted espresso, dropping off your laundry to be washed and heading into one of the massage rooms, don't freak out. All these things are here for you to actually use, and don't worry that someone's going to judge you for taking advantage of it. Just relax. But a person can get fired from Valve. This book encourages us to take risks, to ignore the fear of making a mistake. But it also acknowledges that there are, in fact, some bad ways to fail. You could repeat the same mistake over and over. You could fail to listen to customers or peers. before or after a failure, before and after a failure has occurred. So as the handbook explains, every employee is subject to review and rank from each other. So they literally provide metric reviews of each other and produce an evaluation that is used to determine salary. Perhaps then the deepest contradiction of this handbook is that every reminder to think independently is matched with one to serve Valve's customers. Every company, as it says, every company will tell you that the customer is boss, but here that statement has weight. This is a contradiction, ultimately, that has to be resolved in the mind of every employee. It is a risk passed on from management to the individual. So this guidebook is, I think, extremely clever in the way that it has institutionalized the principles of Valve's founders. And it has really translated this into the social and intellectual life of the company. But in the sense, we might also be, we might be tempted to call it a kind of manifesto. But beneath this kind of can-do spirit, the text shies away from acknowledging responsibility for the company's most critical contradiction. The guidebook has, in fact, killed the manifesto. It has stripped away the manifesto's revolutionary spirit with reassurances amidst a lack of moral certitude. So at a recent, or somewhat recent GSAPP conference called What Happened to the Architectural Manifesto, Tony Vidler both celebrated and mourned the loss of this genre. Manifestos in their modernist form, in his words, were to attack, to feast. They make trouble, they celebrate, they are a call to action, to reform or to revolutionize. In contrast then, in his words again, the shift from manifesto to theory reflects increasing doubt. Revolutionary stridency has given way to worry about the right way to do architecture, in what is ultimately a shift from the manifesto to rumination. Rem Koolhaas has famously called Learning from Las Vegas the last manifesto, albeit, in Venturi's words, a gentle one. And in an interview I published in Urban Journal recently, Arindam Dutta described both Learning from Las Vegas and Delirious New York as brilliant, quote, brilliant examples of polemics in architecture, exemplary not so much as research as in their imagination and spectacular use of evidence. Practice is more like magic, and I'm happy to confess that I am one of the bewitched. Neither of these texts leave us a whit wiser about the actual dynamics of real estate, land acquisition patterns, capitalization, etc. But what these books represent instead are magisterial curations of architectural impressions, word images concatenated into persuasive fictions such that more conventional historiography confronts its own truth-telling rhetoric as itself a kind of fiction. In that sense, they expose the vulnerability of research or truth criteria as founded. What these books seek to change is the grand narrative. So in this kind of lineage from, well, I'd say Koolhaas kind of defines this lineage from the manifestos, Delirious New York and Learning from Las Vegas, to books about cities, in his words, books about cities that imply manifestos. And here we could imagine books like the Harvard Project on the City volumes, the Harvard Design School Guide to Shopping, Great Leap Forward, and Mutations. More pointedly, these guides are what Enrique Walker has called, quote, the cliché of research without the definition of an argument. Published about the same time as the Project on the City volumes, however, we might claim that Atelier Bauer's projects, Made in Tokyo and Pet Architecture Guidebooks, do both. One of the pitfalls of the guidebook, then, is that it presumes to speak for you. By giving instructions, the guidebook both empowers us to take action, but it while stripping away our ability to interrogate its underlying assumptions. And yet, the guidebook is critical for us today because it dares to go beyond the naivety of the manifesto. It can venture arguments aware of their own contradictions. It can frame a range of possibilities and frame uncertainties in a way that can make a nuanced argument. So I thought I'd show a project that I've been working on that grapples with these questions. And very much in the spirit of Delirious New York and Learning from Las Vegas, I'll run the risk of putting my own work as the appendix to this talk. And I'd like to talk about this project that I've been working on with Eric Carver called The Underdome Guide to Energy. This is an architect's guide to energy. We've created an online database, a series of symposia, and a book that's coming out by Princeton Architectural Press this fall. The idea behind the project is to stage debates around energy in the built environment. So we wanted to go beyond the technocratic assumptions behind greenness, to reject LEED standards and green sourcing mantras, for example, and instead to investigate tacit political narratives about governance, cities, domestic life, and the American dream, among other questions. We hope architects can seize this opportunity to think big with energy and to address collective concerns that it activates. So we mapped a new taxonomy of sometimes contending, sometimes affiliated positions on energy. We see this map as a kind of Mad Max-style stage for debate. And each agenda is then positioned along one of 4 topics: power, territory, lifestyle, and risk, all along a series of axes that are modeled against those in a structuralist grid, say, or the approval, maybe more familiarly, the approval matrix in New York Magazine. Power, for example, asks how governments, corporations, organizations, and individuals have the potential to restructure energy performance. So energy approaches on the top end of the axis, for example, activate grassroots or libertarian ideals, while their opposite state-led reform, while their opposite agendas on the south or the bottom side of the axis model state-led reform. Agendas on the left support a distribution of resources, while on the right, agendas would support market-based models of investment. So each approach is drawn as a kind of dome, under the premise that all architecture, like domes, connects spaces and people through new kinds of enclosures and infrastructures. We've also drawn out each position as a case study to examine its architectural strategies more explicitly. So I'll give a couple of examples of these. And in many of them, all of these come from the topic of power. In many, you see fluctuating forms of private and public capital that have been drawn together in constructing a kind of new form of civic enclosure. So we might, for example, look at the Living City Block, which is a nonprofit associated with Amory Lovins' Rocky Mountain Institute that has started to collectivize power management at the scale of a city block in Denver and Brooklyn. This approach localizes the benefits of energy upgrades while still distributing its risk beyond single landowners. Meanwhile, the Citadel separatist compound in Idaho, it's weird that I said Idaho, empowers its citizens with control of their own means of survival without fear of natural disaster, grid failure, or even taxation. Surprisingly, this level of independence is echoed in the operations of the Bank of America Tower, whose cogeneration plant required Cook and Fox to acquire permits for an entirely dedicated natural gas line to 42nd Street. In still other examples, architecture reifies financial arrangements, such as tax incentives and revenues, while forming new icons of collective identity. At new megastructures like the Hudson Yards redevelopment, state incentives have supported cogeneration and campus-wide smart systems, or other energy incentives have started to carve up icons of New York City, such as the Empire State Building, into climates thanks to tenant sub-metering or localized environmental controls. Meanwhile, the Federal Weatherization Assistance Projects, or WAP, smuggles energy-related funding into public housing projects to support maintenance and building upgrades that would otherwise be impossible, and in the process, reskinning and relining buildings layer by layer. So in each case that we go through in all 4 topics, architects are constructing new relationships between resources and publics. They're grappling with nostalgic images of stability, shaping faces of authority, and organizing bureaucracies to shape new standards. So this book is a cross between a voter guide and an architectural handbook. But instead of offering guidance, it frames debates to inform the decisions affecting our environment. So like architectural graphic standards, it illustrates a variety of techniques that work in contemporary design. And like a voter guide, it frames conflicts and affiliations among agendas, conflicting agendas, to inform the decisions that we take. This guide invites designers to take a stand on the issues while recognizing contradictions and opposing perspectives to this approach. In some cases, differences are irreconcilable and frame choices that must be made through informed public debate. In other cases, however, new alliances or new positions between previously entrenched positions can be found and activated. In this way, the role of the designer is not just to take sides, but to reframe the very terms of debate. So, as a site for action, then, the guidebook wavers between the standardization and the proliferation of new ideas. It also veers between the kind of simple amelioration of anxiety and its closer examination. And James asked me to speak, I think, also to this question of research and the publication. And I think for me, it's a kind of question about how we think of the guidebook as a form of research. I mentioned just now that the power of guidebooks rests in their call to action, but they are often not asked to make claims to truth. They don't necessarily need to validate their findings, or at least as a genre. That's not typical to the guidebook. But really, in every case, the terms of validation are extremely complex. For us, with regards to energy, the terms of validation might be to ask whether an envelope effectively keeps out heat, but it might equally be to ask how an envelope distributes the benefits of energy to society equitably. And in this sense, I believe that guidebooks must assess the terms of success, as well as make claims to validity, and that this, in fact, is their argument, to determine what the claims for success might be. They empower the reader not simply to carry out instructions, but to make decisions. So ultimately, while the guidebook runs the risk of subduing the manifesto's revolutionary tendencies, it can also offer a more nuanced examination of the contradictions behind such a revolution. The guidebook is thus propped delightfully, I think, between reflection and action. Thank you.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Maybe that's what it is.
I just had it. You never know how to change. Yes.
This is not supposed to be up here.
And they were like, oh, seriously? Yeah. And my friend is like, but then they have these worse things.
Yeah.
Which was a good thing. I was not your hand. Integration equals reveal problem. Makes visible insanity.
That's great, thank you. Sure, I'll try.
Can't believe this is happening.
Sorry for the delay. Okay. Well, it's great to be here. And it's great to be with this incredible panel of people who actually I've had the chance of collaborating with before. So it'll be nice to have this sort of discussion afterwards. As James said, I'm a principal at Interborough, and I'm also a professor at NJIT. At Interborough, it's an office in New York that I lead with Tobias Armborst and Daniel DiOca. And I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion today because somehow my calendar just filled up. Okay. Someone please help me. Sorry about that. Okay, great. So I am really excited to be a part of this discussion because published and printed material have always been a part of our practice, and it's really nice to have this opportunity to reflect on the importance of it. In our practice, I've never sort of given a talk specifically about published material. And so what I would like to do is give an introduction to what we do as a practice and then talk about how and why we use publications. And then I'll present one project in detail. And then briefly conclude with the project that's underway. Okay, let's hope this works. So most of our projects deal with the public realm and public life. Sometimes really small things like street furniture. Here you can see a pilot parklet project that we did for Boston's Transportation Authority. We do public parks like Lens Space here, which is in Lower Manhattan. And in our design work, we really strive to create places that are really ambiguous enough to be appropriated and transformed in many different ways. Barry Bergdahl has referred to these as kind of public rec rooms, and we think he means that in a positive way. Places that are really informal enough for people to casually use and make their own. So as part of our design process, we're always working to develop ways to tap into local knowledge, to try to find ways at getting at local knowledge. And in fact, publications have really been played a big role in helping us do that. And so I thought that before getting into the details of anything specific related to our publications, I thought it might make sense to talk a bit about what we're trying to do, why we're doing it, and how we did this through publications. So first, we often use publications to actually investigate a site to better understand how it's used and who are the users. We call this often amongst ourselves detective work. We call it a specific phase of our project. And now there are many cases, we're an architecture and planning firm, right? So we do a lot of projects and they have different clients and so on. But in many cases, we actually start out with a project using, I would say, straight up tried and tested tools of outreach, like an interview or a survey. And we did this in a project, say like here you can see us doing this in Rest Stop. This is a project we did at Pier 42 in Manhattan. But in some cases, and I would say in the more interesting ones, those tried and tested models don't work. They're actually really not that informative and useful. So like here, this is a project that we did in Newark, a neighborhood redevelopment plan for the West Market neighborhood. And in this, we were charged to make a plan, and we had to do outreach, and we did, say, the focus groups that you see us doing here. And what we found was that not the same group of people were always coming to the focus groups. And we were charged to sort of make a plan that worked for the community, but we found that not the entire community was participating in the process. So what we did was that we invented new techniques to get at and to make connections with these groups who weren't participating in the, you'd say the normal or sort of formal process of outreach.
And we used many different techniques, but one of them was that we actually made a series of postcards that had images of the neighborhood, because what we found was that when we looked at the neighborhood, we didn't always necessarily see what other people saw. In some places we might see something that, you know, for us looked like mixed use, we thought this was a great thing. In other cases, for people said, oh, this is a place where people sell drugs. And so we used the postcards as a way to actually engage with different groups that weren't engaging in the process, but then also to help us increase our intelligence about the place in which we were working. We also used publications to make certain conditions and practices visible. There's so many fascinating things that are going out there in the world, and we believe that you can learn from that. And so for us, an important first step is to really make these conditions and practices visible. For example, we've been doing a project called Norks in New York City. It's a project about the elderly in New York City. And it's really, I would say, a more journalistic project in that what we're doing here is we're really documenting and visualizing this phenomenon of Norks, which are naturally occurring retirement communities. There happens to be a lot of them in New York City. This is actually where the whole movement started. There's a disproportionate amount of the elderly in New York who are living in the so-called towers in the park. These are limited equity co-ops that were built by unions in the 1950s. And as probably you all know, that the tower in the park has really been a maligned modernist housing typology, often considered to be a failure. But it turns out that in New York City it works really well as housing for the elderly. And the residents who are living in these Norks have, they really seek to retroactively turn these housing projects into retirement homes. Through this project, we developed a series of products, published products, that visualize how these towers have actually found a second calling, so to speak, for people to age in place. And we actually developed a guide, one of these, the ubiquitous guide to New York City, which did things like summarizes how you actually what are the steps you would take to form a Nork, but also how to guide you through the city to see these places. So we often use our published material to reframe a condition or practice. And by reframing, I mean to put the practice in a different context so that we can see it in a new way. This is a project that we did with Luke. There are pages from a booklet that we made for the Greatest Grid exhibition. It's called The Guide to the Grid. It's about New York City's grid. And it takes on the form of a kid's activity book. Like, I don't know if any of you ever are familiar with HalfLife, the booklet for kids that has games and things like that. But we use that as kind of a model for this. This activity book really shows how people use the grid in New York City, but in a way that maybe we don't really recognize it. And so, for example, here we have the pedestrian playbook. It shows how some people, here we have a sort of a cartoon, an illustration that talks about how one particular pizza delivery service is able to get their pizzas faster because they know how to cross this, use the grid more efficiently instead of cross the lights and so on and so forth. It goes back in history and sort of talks about the commissioners who sort of created the grid in 1811, and then even appropriating certain things like the yearbook, and talk about sort of different blocks within the city that are remarkable for the ways that they use the grid. So again, so this is another form of publication that we use to sort of bring to light the practices of the way that people actually use the grid in the city. So that brings me to my next point, appropriate. So far I've talked about projects that involve postcards, guidebooks, travel guides, and activity book. So we really, in our work, we really enjoy and take pleasure in appropriating these everyday products, right? And you could say that they're really, some might say that they are non-architectural formats. But what we're doing by appropriating these different formats is coming up with ways to engage with different publics and to bring them into the process. So we're basically exploiting these publication formats to reach those different audiences. And so I'm also just going to briefly present another project that we did made in Midtown in 2010. This was a project with the Design Trust for Public Space and the Council of Fashion Designers of America. I'm not going to get into the details of the project, but we were charged to visualize the ecologies of the garment district, and we, which were not recognized by everyone, because most of the things that happened in the garment district are sort of above the ground plane, sort of behind the walls of the garment district. And at that time, the city was considering lifting its protective zoning of the garment making in the city, and so we were challenged to show people how that actually was functioning as an ecology. And here, I'm going to zoom in on one portion of the project where we kind of appropriated the form of the graphic novel to actually explain how users within this ecology, fashion designers, factory owners, and so on, how they sort of made use of the garment district. And again, I'm not going to sort of talk about the project, but you can see here that what we're doing is telling stories about this particular place and explaining how the ecology worked. You can say that this is not a dry, from Luke's perspective, this is not, we're not on the dry side of. And again, sort of, using, and again, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but using those kinds of formats that you would find in comics and graphic novels to explain the story. In this case, the one particular designer, as she matured in the garment district and growing her business. So now, what I'd like to do is talk about one more project in detail. It's Holding Pattern. It was our winning proposal for MoMA PS1. It's a project that we did with Luke and Jessica as the graphic designers, so it'd be nice to also engage in maybe in a conversation about that. So most of you probably, everybody know MoMA PS1, know anything about the competition. It's every year the museum commissions an architecture firm to design and build a setting for a series of performances and events that attract about maybe 6,000 people to the PS1 courtyard in Long Island City every single Saturday during the summer months. So it's a temporary project, and for us, one of the questions about temporary projects is always, what happens to the stuff after the project. This is a previous one. In some cases, actually, after the temporary project, the stuff gets thrown out. So we asked ourselves at the beginning of the process, well, how can we design and build something that could be put to a different use after the event was over? And so when we started looking outside of the walls of MoMA PS1, you can see there's this, the building itself, and then the courtyard with this 16-foot concrete wall. PS1 is located in Long Island City. It's really diverse, really interesting part of New York. And MoMA PS1 is an incredible institution, but it's also a little bit insulated from all the good things that happen outside of its walls. And so we started this project by just hanging out in the neighborhood and talking to many people. And one of the people that we first talked to was a person who ran a taxi stand across the street. You can see here, his name was Takis, and he actually set up this little plaza for his taxi drivers who come in and change they do their shifts here. So one taxi driver is outside driving in the city driving this cab, and he comes in, someone else is waiting, and they switch. And this is where the guys, primarily guys, wait. And when we saw this, you can see it has some plastic chairs, it has an awning, some trees. We thought it was a really interesting space, and it suggested to us that some of MoMA PS1's programmatic requirements for the courtyard for warm-up, which were provide some shade, provide some seating. They really, in some cases, they actually aligned with some of the things that were happening out in the neighborhood, and this gave us an idea. So we started asking everyone in the neighborhood, all PS1's neighborhoods, if they had anything that they needed that we could design for them, use in the courtyard over the summer, and then give it to them in the fall once the project was over. And so we talked to a lot of people, and I'm not going to focus on this, asking them what they needed. Kids, adults, people wanted trees, outdoor furniture. This guy wanted mirrors for his ballet school. And so here, instead of working for one client, we're actually working for a lot of different clients. And this is, I want to sort of tie this to the publication. So we talked to many people and organizations, and I have to admit that some of them had some very bad ideas. We didn't use those. So for example, you can see in the upper, the upper left, right, oh no, let me see, the lower left, Long Island City Millstones group. There's a group that wanted to store a number of millstones, these really huge pieces of stone. We talked to them. Anyway, we've mapped all of the different people on this axis of in the public interest and fun, and then we use this as a way to sort of develop our program. So you can see here in the lower right, the Court Square Library, they asked for books. That's in the public interest, but it's not so fun. The Millstone group, that's actually not in the public interest and not fun. So we didn't include any of those, but all the stuff in the upper right we did, and we built or bought these things that people requested: the chairs, the benches, the lifeguards, chess tables, trees, and so on. And you can see them here. And then you can see the final destinations of all these things. And these are the pages from a newspaper that we made with them that documented the project. These are places that are all over Queens. And so before everything was delivered to our clients in the fall, it was stored in the courtyard for the summer, creating a setting for the series of performances there. Not going to talk too much about it. You can see that there's a tree room, lots of trees. There was, we tagged everything so you could see where they would go. In the fall, we had the mirror room. This guy asked for the mirrors. We put them in this space. Kind of a cool, sort of playing with the kind of feeling of the Contemporary Art Museum, very referencing minimalism. It's also a place where all the hipsters like to get their picture taken. So it's a very, very popular spot. And then the ballet school had an event there. And so we asked all of our clients if they wanted to use the courtyard over the summer, and if they wanted to do any events there. And so here you can see a poster that we made that shows one of those events that the ballet school did. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of these fascinating tidbits. But here you can see some of these images of the courtyard over the summer, where people's stuff was, and I would say. And so here you see them in the courtyard, and then in the fall you can see them going to the taxi stand. Here you see the foosball table going to the settlement house, rock climbing wall going to the Long Island City Kids, and so on. The chess tables going to the Newark, and so on. And so we created, with them, actually created a series of publications, of printed material that sort of visualized this process. And I wanted to talk for a moment about this newspaper that we made, because this newspaper had all of the product, had all of the essential elements of the project that explained it, but it had these portraits of our expanded client group. So it was really more like, I would say, kind of like a local newspaper, like a town newspaper that has these stories about these different people. So I think in one respect, this newspaper made visible or explained the project, but at the same time, the newspaper itself went out into the neighborhood. So it was in the local, the local restaurants and the bodegas, and left at people's doors. So it actually was part of the architectural project in that it facilitated this connection between the people within the institution and our clients and our potential collaborators outside of the walls of the museum. So I think it was really working on these two levels, and for me I think it's a kind of compelling example to respond to James's call for this discussion today. And so what you can say, what we were trying to achieve with the newspaper, but also with the project in a sense, was to even for just temporary moments, to create this radical public space that sort of brought together these different groups, not only the warm-up hipsters, the contemporary art enthusiasts, but also the people who actually came to see their stuff, like their sandbox or their tree, and in that way create the space and encounter this public space, albeit a temporary one, within the corridor itself. I mentioned to you before, we also had this poster that outlined the different events that we scheduled. This has worked along similar lines. We invited the groups like the New York Irish Center. They did a quilt making workshop. The bike group came in, did bike repair. This is a fascinating one, which I don't have time to talk about, but this is in Long Island. We partnered with the library, Queens Library, and we invited the artists who actually are working, who had pieces in PS1, to pick their favorite book and to read it to kids who came from. So again, sort of mixing these different groups up. That's the artist there. B-boy workshops, aerosol workshops, and so on. So in closing, what I wanted to do, and it's just 20 minutes, so if I can have one more minute, I would appreciate it. I'm out of time. I wanted to talk about a project that we're working on right now. We've actually been working on this project for 5 years, so I feel a little bit lame to say that we're working on it now, but we're really just about to finish it. It's a book called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. I wanted to add this to our vocabulary of appropriated publication typologies, because this is really a dictionary. It's a dictionary of weapons that are used by all sorts of urban actors to either give access or restrict access to space. This project started out when we were curating the American section of the 2009 Rotterdam Architecture Biennial, which was about this concept of the open city. We were doing community, the American way of living, and in this project we had started to curate this collection of what we were calling weapons. And since doing that project in 2009, we've developed this into a book, and it has now over 100 entries of different weapons that have been used to either give access to space or restrict access to space. This was kind of the mother of them all. It's called the exclusionary amenity. We had sort of, as part of the exhibition, had looked at Ave Maria. It's an all-Catholic community just outside of Naples in Florida. We were kind of curious, like, how can you have an all-Catholic community in the United States when that's actually illegal? Actually, what developers do, they use this thing called an exclusionary amenity. They build something within a community like a church, and then any people who move into the community have to pay for the maintenance of it. So for example, if you're not Catholic, why would you move into this community? Because you don't want to pay the maintenance for the church. The most famous example of this is a golf course. So we've actually taken these entries, like for example, the exclusionary amenity is not written by us. It's written by an expert in the field, Leor Stralabevlich. But then we've also illustrated it. These are examples of all sorts of different exclusionary amenities, like the golf course, large lot zoning, CC&Rs. I'm not going to talk about these now. Question. They're all things big and small. They're organized around different tours. I'll just show you these images because they're just tantalizing. You might wonder, are these giving access to space, restricting access to space? For example, methane. This is like something that's been used by the city of Beverly Hills to prevent the State Department of Transportation from bringing a subway through Beverly Hills because they claim that it's going to create a massive explosion, and they have a whole film about it. So some of them are funny, some of them are very mundane. But I think as the root idea of the book is that all of these tools, they can be used for good or bad, but ultimately it's I think it's a very optimistic book because it suggests that the city is makeable and that these tools can be used for good or for bad. But we, as architects and people who are engaged in city making, can use. We have the agency to make the city, and we can invent new tools as well. So it's a collection of existing tools and then illustrations that support that. And I hope you all look out for it when it comes out later this year. Thank you. Okay.
show my students and say what I'm
history by other means, either in the form of your, I love the sort of interdiscursive, like the literal reading between the pages to kind of surface a different kind of, knowledge of popular culture, or in the case of Jeanette's sort of tour of kind of precedent and prototype. Like I think that your sort of really great theorization guidebook is actually, in certain ways, a historical one, because you're finding the examples that have proven sort of operative at different moments in time. And I would say that that's very much part of the sort of arsenal of exclusion and inclusion, which is such a sort of like potent look, I think, at the kind of, it's interesting, it kind of gives a friendly and oddly legible face to total spatial violence, which is a sort of interesting, like, back and forth where you're like, on the one hand, it's like, it's very engaging and humorous in many ways because of the total absurdity of these things, and yet it sort of illuminates a kind of really strong move that's being made by various actors that sometimes we can and sometimes we can't control. So I guess, I mean, maybe my question in this, since this is a sort of history that is supposed to then activate some kind of other perception of architecture, is the degree to which, in my seminar we actually had Michael Kimmelman last semester, and he talked about a sort of post-occupancy criticism, which I think is really interesting because the theme here is that, the book is not done when you put the covers on. Like, when you put the covers on, it's the moment when the book starts doing its work, or when you take the covers off, as the case might have been. And so I'm wondering if there's a sort of, any way of kind of charting the efficacy behind these sorts of projects, and whether you've had, I mean, I know that some of them are actually about to come out, which makes this an unfair question. But how we see these sorts of books actually activating a kind of public or changing the terms of debate. This was something I think Jeanette said really nicely, which is that it's not so much a set of truth claims, but a set of action claims, or kind of, to use Keller's term, instead of the knowing that, it's the knowing how. Do they work?
Seems like there's a value in, or I think speaking from like a publisher's point of view, I think that the book as tool is very attractive because it almost builds in a certain assumption of interest. And also I think there's a little, and I think there's also a little bit of a degree of like trying to figure out what exactly should an architecture book do now. And so the utility value is something that seems very attractive because then it has almost a self-justification built into it. And I hadn't really actually thought about it much as a typology. We had one time we had done the time saver standards as something to pull apart. And I loved that book, but it was really inert when you tore it apart. So I kind of veered away from the kind of like a guidebook and the professional book, which I think is also kind of trying to undergird the idea of the book, or the book, as in going all the way back to Vitruvius as being this sign of a profession, right? And I think that still underlies this kind of the architecture book and the monograph especially, as it says this is a professional practice. So I think that's a big part of it. These like loose books, like looser books that you saw in the 90s, and I think are not, you don't actually see them very much anymore. We've moved into the guidebook era, I think.
Yeah. So I think you're right, but at the same time, I wanted to use Jeanette's as a hint, because I think we're moving out of the guidebook era. For me, the guidebook era is everything from the Harvard Project on the City that I was part of to Elements, you know, the kind of Venice, you know, and Rem was here, you know, on Friday. And for me, that guidebook is dead. Like, Elements for me is dead. Like, I mean, there's nothing, I can't, no effect, no affect, no, like, I really, like, I can't, and I find that, like, we can't go back to the Manifesto because we're too self-conscious, but we want to go back to some kind of expanded, you know, territory for practice or engagement, or, I mean, you're doing guidebooks, but they're very, like, this is my territory, and I'm not writing Manifesto, I'm acting in that way, and I think even the last book, you know, it's blue and red, and you're making like really, you're starting to make like value judgments. You know, it's no longer just the kind of the world is complex. I'm going to describe the world. Here's the Harvard Project on the City that undermines discourse and it's, you know, claiming that we can only be doing field work. But I feel like we've done doing the field work. Like we sort of know, you know, what globalization does to architecture. We know all these things now, and I think that even your word expand, right? It's really sort of kind of opening up and finding new moments for action. And so I feel very optimistic about the post-guidebook era. We need a new word somehow.
Yeah.
I had a word at the end of my presentation, and I skipped over because I was out of time, but not that anybody rushed me. The last page I had was sort of advocate, and I think that, and for us, I think that's really what we're trying to do. It's not like we're evenly presenting anything, but that we are trying to advocate for particular outcomes, and with the arsenal in particular, I think what we're firstly doing is we're taking these things that people don't even think about, like say an armrest on a bench, like you just take it for granted, and what the book does is actually sheds light on it and makes you look at that armrest on the bench, and it's not just a piece of street furniture, it's explicitly there to prevent a homeless person from occupying it at night. And so I think that with these kinds of publications and with our practice, certainly, we're trying to advocate for particular outcomes, and in this case, for a more just society through building a better physical environment. And so I'm also very optimistic too, but I think that you have to, in order to make those changes, and what we're trying to do in the book is to present things that people almost take for granted and try to have them look at it in a new way, but then at the same time make it so that different groups of people will see it. And so you said that it's kind of lighthearted, but I think what we're trying to do is to have different groups of people read the book, so it wouldn't just be shown or read in a school of architecture, but that somebody would just pick it up off of the shelf and then all of a sudden recognize, like, what is the impact of the federal highway, you know, the way that the federal highways have been financed. We all know that, and people in school know that, but not everybody else knows how that has actually made the built environment less, you know, as it made it worse for people who live in cities.
Is there some aspect of that book that is combinatory, in that you could take a strategy A, B, and C, and then you can posit something, like how those things happen?
Yeah, we still have the tours. We still have the tours, which you would remember. So we have different tours that you can then go, because it's alphabetical, and you can then go through a particular sequence of weapons. So if you want to see why why America is so racially segregated, then you can go through all the bad ones, and it's not pretty, I'll tell you. Or then if you want to see, like, say, the weak tactics of the strong, there's that whole sequence too. So we have those tours to work with.
And I think, to me, it's kind of a similar thing with the book that you're presenting too. Is there something that shows that operational proposition?
Of recombination.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very much the premise of the book. But
Yeah.
it's true that it's not yet a part of, or it is not a part of the structure of the book.
Right.
But it is a big part of the way I teach, actually. And
Yeah, right, of course.
I mean, although my book hasn't come out yet, I have been teaching on it for a couple of years, and each of my students is kind of positioning themselves around that grid, and then testing the relationship between these attitudes. And so you find that sometimes you can use the same attitude and do the exact opposite of what's intended, and maybe the way that some of your weapons could get flipped. And yeah, it's fun, I think, to see how fluid some of those assignments are.
So that's like the testing, that's the testing factor I think you're talking about. That you kind of want to, it's funny because on the one hand you want to see those tests, but on the other hand you don't want to close down potential readings that could come out of it. But at the same time, there's like, oh, if I saw this, then I could imagine this. It's like a pattern book that needs to be tested to be understood in its ramifications.
And I'm also interested in the choice of the books you're expanding, because they're not guidebooks. They're actually really kind of personal,
Or
sort of,
monography.
yeah, but very, you said obscure or.
Some of them. Well, the ones I'm choosing, there's a formalism in the design of those books which asks to be broken, and that's the other agenda of the seminar is to also be able to activate that.
But you're not breaking it by turning those into guidebooks or a guide to the work. You're almost inserting another personal sort of. It's a conversation between these images. I mean, I think it's kind of a really interesting way to expand. It's much more about the imagination and the affect and the discourse than a literal.
Yeah, I kind of want simultaneity. I don't want to collapse the difference of the existing book relative to its context, but just to be able to. It's, the engine of the book is really the spread, that dichotomy of like on the left and on the right and what can happen in between those two spaces. And so these projects are able to activate that and very, very quickly. And that's a big part of, because it's also trying to fit within the context of 4 other projects. So there's an efficacy factor there too. If we had the ability to kind of, be more, to produce more of a vivisection of the book rather than just kind of flaying it open, I think it could be a different project.
It's funny because I hadn't seen that project before, but on the one hand, you could say that it's you had talked about it sort of contextualizing, but because there are these monographs of the gods, in some respect, I feel like it's an implicit criticism that so much of architecture production assumes that it can operate on its own and do its own thing and be produced in its own system and in its own culture and its own context. And I guess one reading would be that the insertion of these historical pages is, you could say that it's complementing it, so you show how, one person was interested in steel construction and that was influencing it. But on the other hand, in some cases, it seems to be suggesting that so much of architectural production has been completely separated and not acknowledging the real problems in the world. And the most compelling one for me was the facing of the Seagram's boardroom and then the counter. So, I mean, I guess it's such a rich project because you could take those two readings, rub it. But I guess, going back to what I was saying before about the arsenal, I mean, I feel like the point where we're at is that architectural production is so much enmeshed in all of these other forces, and we would do good as architects to make it visible.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things to me about the sort of two ends of this conversation is that I think there's been a refusal in all of these of a sort of distinction between a mainstream culture and a counterculture, in the sense that you take this absolutely iconic architectural lineage and insist on inserting the sort of the lunch counter and like all the sort of detritus. Mm-hmm. And that then, you know, I think the guidebook is a form, you know, when you talk about the sort of nostalgia that's embedded in it, in certain ways, like it is because it's very much a kind of do-it-yourself countercultural artifact. In some way, like even the word arsenal, like I think speaks to that there is implicit in the sort of form's lineage a kind of withdrawal, like we're giving you the tools to do it yourself so that you don't have to be engaged in this sort of larger cultural apparatus. And I think what's really interesting about all of these projects is the refusal of that sort of distinction, that it's no longer a kind of countercultural move of stepping outside of a norm, but it's a kind of operating guide to the system that you're in instead of the sort of whole earth kind of withdrawal.
Should we? Since
Yeah, let's
we're
take some questions.
Since
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
so
yeah.
intimate, maybe we should open it up. Jacob?
I was just wondering, I mean, really, the conversation's been really nice because it wove together a few themes I hadn't really picked up, but it seems like the sort of way you guys are identifying and then subverting or modifying certain categories within publishing has been really central to the way you use books in your own practice. And I'm wondering, I mean, for each of you, you have dealt with, so that's within architecture, say, as a broad category, where we all acknowledge that books and publishing play a very central role in different ways. But then you each engage with a publishing culture that is not so flexible, say, and has the history of Manifesto, the history of the Guidebook, the history of the monograph are relatively rigid categories, I would say, from my own experience still. And I was wondering, from a different angle, seeing the PS1 project again, which is a fantastic project, I was wondering, and the way that you guys leveraged, which is like a really great move on architects' part, to leverage the process, say, the competition, you know, what more can we do with this than maybe they were expecting. I'm wondering if you guys each, in your own practices, as you engage or encounter friction with the publishing world, that, I mean, I'm really excited to see PAP is doing your book. And anyway, and I don't know who's doing this last book with you guys, but what's that? I was just wondering, you know, are there different ways to leverage that interaction that is otherwise often difficult, let's say, especially when you were saying, well, it's not a monograph, it's none of this, it's this, we're thinking of it as advocacy, but you know, if it doesn't come with a clear category, which is something especially marketing departments obviously look for, how do you, as architects say, you know, if we consider ourselves to be especially innovative, or whatever the word we want to use, have you guys found ways to leverage those structures? I mean, maybe it's just anecdotal for each of you, and I know not all of these have traditional publishing or publishers, say, partnering for these projects, but anyway, I'm just wondering about that interaction, because obviously publishing within architecture is not, you know, it's not all just like books where we get to do what we want. It's
What are you doing?
we in the capital world, you know, I mean, you know, Wiley isn't gonna, you know. So I'm just curious, maybe it's anecdotal or what, but how you've approached that. Have you been able to make that encounter productive in surprising ways, or is it always? My experience is that it's often just challenging. Yeah.
It's so funny because we are so excited to go with PAP, and you know, I think of this project as a somewhat populist project. It's red and blue for precisely that reason, and they categorize us as an academic book in their own kind of internal structure. And I just thought that was so, I kind of don't want to admit that because I don't think of the project that way. But they categorize it that way because we talk about political ecology as a theory that should influence architecture. And so for us, it was like completely the reverse of how we saw it. But I don't think that's influencing the way the book's coming out. But I would say, so I feel like my encounter with the more mainstream world was surprising in that regard. But then in other ways, I've done projects that are like never bothered to go through a publisher. And I was thinking about putting Safari 7 and the other cities into the talk today, but I think for us that was a way of distributing tours about urban ecology through podcasts that you can download and like ads that could get that got printed on the subways and things like that. So I found it fun to be able to work in a kind of low-cost medium that allows you to just like kind of get out into the subway in our case.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about how you disseminate. So we did this book called 49 Cities, and we did it with Storefront, and within the first few months, like we sold 2,000 copies. And then we went back and met with a few publishers, and they were like offering no money, and I mean, it was ridiculous. We're like, okay, second edition, Storefront, sold another 2,000 copies, and now we're going to do a kind of beautiful third edition already with Storefront, and even, you know, so there's something about like the moment where you just, there's so many platforms now that I think that at some point it'll be interesting to see how publishers adapt to that as well, where I think Irma on Friday was, you know, I think her position is interesting, which is if you're going to go through publishing, then there's something about the object, right? I mean, suddenly, like you can either disseminate through whatever, print on demand or Avery Review, or you know, really embrace the EPUB and the digital, or embrace the kind of absolute beauty of the kind of, you know, the kind of weight of the artifact. So it may be that otherwise it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you know, architects get the author gets nothing, and you know, you get really. So I think the landscape is changing somehow.
Yeah. David, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it kind of dovetails on that idea of what the sort of status of the object is, and one of the things I noticed about all of the presentations and everything we're talking about is that the book seems to have lost its identity as anything static, but maybe it never had that identity, but especially by going back and revising the book itself, by tearing it up, or by revisiting one project again to expand, you know, the original terms, or explicitly incorporating an audience into the production of the book about a project about them. I mean, each of these things is a very interactive and very sort of two-way process. And I'm wondering how, you know, if we're talking, like if we think of architecture in the Sissi, it's a lot, you know, that's architecture as media. And how does the object become an object of engagement? Like, what are the sort of means that you might use to push the book into that two-way dynamic? Or, so like I know the Midtown project is also online. You can click and see and explore it different ways. So yeah.
Yeah, that project you can only experience online.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of the examples I gave, they're not actually books. I mean, they are, they live as digital things, or they've been, you know, postcards or posters. So I think that, and they've been, you know, self-published. They haven't been done with publishers. So I think for us, it's less about the artifact, and really more using it as a tool to advance our agenda of, you know, making more connections with different users, learning more about a place, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think in a way, actually, this has been something we've wrestled with a lot, because it's like with the internet, where the idea that it's on the internet, therefore it's public. But like, how do you actually build a public around a medium? And I think the same goes for sort of postering and things like this. It's like we signify publicness, and whether we're actually building those publics, I think, is sometimes up for debate. Sophie, okay.
So actually, thank you for the presentations. I think they were really terrific. I have two separate questions. The first one is about the graphics that some of you are using, because, so I guess my question is, the graphics that you're using, are they somewhat ingrained in a political project, either historically or currently? I thought very interesting about your project was that I was, on one hand, thinking about some of the early graphics of Ware, but also some of the more alternative publications that come out of Bedford Press. I think there was this really nice overlap also in the case. And with the latter two projects, I was interested if you could talk about some of the revolutionary practices, even of the 1920s, if some of these graphics are mobilized in your project. And then the second question I had was, you mentioned also that one aspect of your project is to make visible invisible forces in the built environment. And I'm wondering, I guess you have to be able to see very consciously in order to make these forces visible. So my question is, maybe you could talk a little bit also about the theoretical bodies of literatures that you're drawing on in your practices to make these things visible.
As far as the method, the method for those books is really limited. It's almost just like Xeroxing some stuff and throwing it together. It's very much like 3 chords make a band, kind of an ethic, right? So it's a fast and dirty process, and so there's not really very much consideration as to composition in a kind of 2-dimensional sense, but in the kind of comparative and 4-dimensional sense of it, that how things kind of unfold as a manifold of surfaces is how that thing gets constructed. So there's a funny thing, like I always think about this Stephen Hole project at Chiasma Museum, and I remember him describing that project as one where the mid-level of detail had been completely dropped out of the building. So it was all like details at the hand level, and then there's the gesture, the thing, and everything in between fell out. And I've always been really interested in just letting a whole kind of aspect of design just drop out and not do anything with it. And I think these projects do that as a matter of necessity. In order to work quickly, but I also think that they present in a very open way, which I like a lot. So I think that's. And then there's the reuse, adaptation, remix. All of these may be much more contemporary compositional methods that I think are active in that project. So it's never really about typeface or grid or any of that kind of Swiss stuff. It's more punk in its ethic.
I was going to say that in response to your first question, we're not referring to any of the sort of the revolutionaries of the early 20th century. I think really what the precedents that we're looking at are really more from popular culture, and in particular, we're all, my partners and I, we're very much interested in the everyday, and so I think that if I were to make references to things that we've looked at, it would be things like, popular magazines like The New Yorker with The Matrix, or say IKEA manuals, or local newspapers, and I mean probably the most non-everyday would be like, we look a lot at the work of Chris Ware, but I think, I think what we're trying to do is to use these everyday ways of communicating to get at connections to people who are normally outside of architectural production. So I think it's appropriate to maybe to appropriate these methods of representation.
Can I add something about the AXO? The AXO is having a huge comeback. It's been a few years now. Huge comeback. Did anybody see Christina Goberna and Witzy's it was amazing axonometric extravaganza of a room. So can we, so what does the AXO do? And then the line drawing in the AXO and the blue and the red. And your, unbelievable axonometric of New York and the little people, so, I don't know. Can you talk about the AXO?
I've been asking myself that question all the time, because I think since made in Tokyo, it's very difficult to imagine a conceptualization of a project, a conceptualization of a research project without an axonometric, and I think it's become so dominant for us. I don't yet have the full answer to how I understand our lineage in relation to Gawa, but I will explain some of the ideas behind our drawings, which was that we had this kind of metaphor of a gel cap. When you see a gel cap, you see the kind of translucent skin, and then you see the little bubbles inside. And our whole project is about this idea that architecture acts like a dome, whether it looks like it or not, and it's always regulating this kind of interior and a set of systems. And so we always wanted to exaggerate this sense that there was like an outer skin, like the gel cap, and then the line drawing, the articulation of the line drawing would enable you to see the kind of systems and layers and beneath that. So I think for us it was interesting as a way to talk about both envelope and system. And then we use the podium as like that arbitrary ground cut. So every single image has a podium. And then that allows us to say, this site is actually related to that site, this site is inside that one. In this case, it's the ground that functions like a dome. So I think those are some of our ideas behind it. The historical analysis of the AXO, please someone do that, because I really want to understand that.
But it's a very different moment because the AXO was so much about the perfect, objectification of architecture and the kind of abstraction, but the AXO now has a sort of pop, and tying the micro and the macro, and you can see the person and the systems and so the kind of entire world can be represented, and it's lost its kind of abstract quality, even though it's still this sort of like seemingly objective.
Yeah, but I think it's something that enables you to describe more than the architecture, like you were saying before, occupancy or the other systems.
Right, which it wasn't used for that. It's a kind of new use of the axon.
Right.
Yeah,
and also I think
really
that the plan itself, in a way, is something that only the architects can understand, and I feel like that the axonometric gives us information about, it's to someone who is not sort of trained also can actually read, it's more descriptive because it describes spatial qualities as opposed to the plan itself, which is always one step away. It's another way of representing architecture that only the architect can understand.
I think it's World of Warcraft. I think it's a modality of vision that we have. It's very, very strong and very easy to read for a lot of people now.
I think it's also interesting though that it allows you to sort of fragment something into discrete parts, whereas like if the sort of 70s AXO is about a kind of taut wholeness, like these are AXOs that like you really break it apart, and I think it lends itself to taxonomies, to dictionaries, to like these different sort of breaking apart that pernicious.
It's more the axon as fragment or collection of loosely connected systems and fragments.
And it also exists, I think, as a foil to the rendering.
Yeah,
I think that's a big part of it, because it has it still maintains some kind of idea of objectivity, which is completely been well extinguished.
It seems important. I remember what was sort of significant to me about Made in Tokyo when it came out was that it treated everything the same. That you could never say, this building is more important than this other, this is the center of the city, and that's the outside. So, although I think that maybe there's a legibility behind it, I actually wonder if it might be more anti-humanist, that there's a desire to kind of strip one narrative outside of the city to actually produce this kind of even tone.
Well, I think we have to return the room at 2.
One last question.
One last.
If we return the room, I won't go on about the access, but say many things. But I was really taken with the yellow inserted pages, and particularly with this example of the sit-in and the boardroom. I think in part because what it relative to the question of manifesto and self-consciousness, the yellow inserted pages are manifesto-like in their clarity, right? There's no question of the argument made by the person inserting that yellow page, and in a way that even the original book and its dullness might evade stating a thesis as quickly as that, so it operates at very, the register of criticism. I think it's interesting to think about that as a technique applied to some of these other genres. The guidebook came up earlier as a possible site for this, and I wonder if the point Jeanette made about the guidebook's claims to not make claims, of sort of the postponement of final truth, what would happen with the yellow pages applied to that in their manifestos, but also to some of these other projects where precisely the thing the yellow pages are supposed to do, right, in inserting the larger world to the monograph, will they allow us to perceive in projects that claim to already do that, right? Something that claims to be an engaged project, or claims to involve real world, or claims to be self-aware, self-conscious, and full of ironies, something that's already remixed itself. Some of these 90s books would be potential use of that. Would the yellow pages allow us to test the rhetorical Teflon, right? The claims these books make to be sort of almost uncriticizable because they're already doing it, or they're already plugged in.
Yeah.
Do operations like the yellow pages work there, or would they just become more full bleed images stuffed into something like SNL itself? Would they
Yeah, that's the example I was thinking of. Is like, okay, if that's 1,369 pages, when we double that down, that's a big book.
You have to start removing.
That's actually what I thought, is that maybe we should strip it out and replace all of the reference images, basically. But it's so synthetic in that book that it would be really a lot of work.
Maybe you can thin it.
Yeah, so we would basically just like expunge it, like pull all the advertising out, which is for Feigen's image essay. So I think that would be the way of doing it. I wonder that too, because SMLXL is, after all, it is the model for the proposition. Right on the very first page, the introduction, the one-page introduction to a 1,300-page book. It says, this is an expanded Ismonic view of architectural practice. Anything can come in because it does anyway. And so I just want to test that across, like, what happens when you do that with Hayek? I don't know. When you see Mickey Mouse and Hayek together, what happens? And I mean, maybe it's obvious, and I think the project exhausts probably after this round. Because I think we've learned what we needed to without actually going in and writing that essay about, looking at the Seagram boardroom versus the sit-in.
Yeah. I guess I'm wondering if it would be possible to show that everything's not in SML itself through these kinds of images.
Yeah.
Right? Like, could you still show the same kind of missingness that's pointed out with the Seagram example?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to you guys for joining in this lovely little seminar. Appreciate it. It's really great.
Excellent. That is not